Charles Dickens opened one of his famous novels, A Tale of Two Cities, with these famous words: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." The Christmas season can be both the best of times and the worst of times. Oh, if we have lots of gifts to give and we get lots of gifts in return, if we have friends and family to spend the holiday with, Christmas can be the best of times. But if we aren't going to get a lot of gifts, or we don't have the money to buy the gifts that we would like to give, or if we don't have friends and family to spend it with, Christmas can be the worst of times. Interestingly enough, in the Bible, Christmas is both the best of times and the worst of times as well. It's the best of times. It's the story of Jesus' birth. The wonderful good news of God coming into our midst in love in the baby Jesus, the Savior, that is the Messiah or the chosen one of God, the Prince of Peace, Emmanuel, God with us. And Matthew tells us a wonderful add-on to the Christmas story of the Magi, or the so-called wise men, who have traveled hundreds of miles from the east to come and worship the newborn King. And they've brought their very expensive gifts as offerings, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And all of this to show, as Matthew, the gospel writer, likely intended, that Jesus is to be a King of kings, not just for Israel, but for all nations. Christmas is the best of times, this wonderful good news of Jesus' birth. But it's also the worst of times. For the current political ruler, the current king of the people of Israel, Herod, wants to kill this newborn baby. Because the current king, Herod, sees this potential future king as a threat. Herod was in many ways a very successful ruler. He was a king over Israel and surrounding regions on behalf of the Roman Empire. And he had achieved great success politically because he was very astute and wise politically. He came to be known as Herod the Great. He was successful. Even to this day, he's remembered as a great builder of monumental architecture. Apparently, if you go to the Holy Land, I've never been, but if you go, the greatest ancient ruins to be seen were built under Herod the Great. Herod was great in a political sense, but he was also a madman, especially more so as he aged. Over the course of his reign, he was known as a butcher. Killed even many members of his own family, his sons and even his wives. And so when news of a newborn king comes to him, his first reaction is fear. And he plans to have this baby eliminated, because that will be the fastest and easiest way to get rid of any threat to his rule and to his power. And so he orders the execution of this child. But of course, he doesn't even know who the child is. He doesn't know who its parents are, even what it looks like. And so just to be on the safe side, he orders the murder of all the baby boys in the town of Bethlehem, where this future king was purported to have been born. And just to be on the extra safe side, he puts out the order for all of the baby boys 2 years old and younger, according to the timing of the appearance of the star as it had been reported to him by the Magi. Now, Matthew, the gospel writer, tells us this terrible story and concludes it by letting us know that the mothers of Bethlehem cried out for their sons, but they could not be comforted, for their sons were not there. It's an appalling story of evil of the worst kind, a vicious attack on innocent children. I'm sure all of us wish we could say that this is an isolated incident in human history, but of course we know it is not. It was just a year ago this month when another madman walked into the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, and murdered in cold blood 20 children and 6 members of the staff. Sometime last fall, just after we had moved to Barrie, we were in a store and we lost Emily, our little girl, for about 10 minutes. And I have to tell you, it was the most terrifying 10 minutes of my life. Now, I had no reason to think that anything had happened to her or that she'd been taken by someone, except that if she had been taken, I'm pretty sure that's what the first 10 minutes would feel like. Isn't it terrible that we live in a world where people are willing to do harm to children, and that we as parents and grandparents have to fear for our children? And not just out in the world. Anyone who's been paying attention to the news for the last 10 or 20 years will realize that even within the Christian church, people have done terrible things to children. I'm reminded of that famous poem known as Footprints in the Sand, where the narrator is looking back on her life. And in most of her life, she sees 2 sets of footprints walking in the sand, and she knew that one set of footprints was hers and the other was God's. And then in the most difficult times in her life, she saw there was only one set of footprints and says to God, "Where were you? Where were you when I needed you the most? Where were you when things were at their worst?" Amazingly enough, there is good news in the story from Matthew's Gospel that we have heard. On the one hand, there is good news in that God has come into our midst in grace and in love into the world as it actually is. The story of Herod's evil act is not presented as God's will. It is something which has happened in spite of God's will. And yet, even in a world where terrible things can happen, God has not kept the world at arm's length. God has chosen to come in and to be part of our world, to share our experience and even to know our suffering. feel what we feel in order that all of our lives might be redeemed. We probably all would be happier a little bit with the Bible if a story like this had not been included. And in fact, we would be free, I suppose, to exclude it from all of our Christian experience. But if we take out such a story, what we're left with is a God who is unable or unwilling to be in the world as it actually is. Walter Brueggemann wrote in a very well-known prayer, "We thank you for the babe born in violence." It's a thanksgiving that God has come into our world as it actually is. And even beyond this, there is more good news. It is not just that God has come into our world as it actually is. It is that God redeems it from what it is, promising to transform it into what God intends it to be. You see, the main narrative of the story is that the baby Jesus, by the hand of divine providence, is rescued from the wrath of the evil king, Herod the Great. The story is told of how Joseph received a calling in the night to flee to Egypt for the safety of the boy and their family. And in his faithful obedience, he takes the risk and leads his family to safety. And then at the appropriate time, he has remained attentive to God's call. He has brought the family back to Israel, and specifically to the town of Nazareth, where the angel of God has said, that is where the boy is to be raised. That is where he will be safe. And it is because God's wisdom and providence have intervened and rescued the child that he grew up to be the Jesus in whose name we have gathered here today. He was allowed to become the Jesus who traveled around the countryside and into the towns and the cities of Israel, proclaiming God's love and the good news of the arrival of God's kingdom. It was because this Jesus had been allowed to grow and to mature that he was able to travel around, healing the sick and feeding the hungry. And it was because of all this that he was able to live such a long and a faithful life to God, which was brought to an end, of course, on the cross, and yet revived in the resurrection. When Matthew, the gospel writer, tells us that the mothers of Bethlehem cried for their sons, but they could not be comforted because their sons were not there, I at least hear a reminder of the story of Easter, where on the third day, the women from Jesus' company of followers went to his tomb only to find that he was not there, for he had been risen. And it is because of the end of Jesus' story and his victory over evil and even death that I can have hope that even those baby boys of Bethlehem are in God's eternal and loving care, both now and forever. It's very difficult, I find, to have optimism that we humans are really making the world a better place. We will all remember, for example, with horror, those days last December when we would turn on the news and see how the world's media had descended on Newtown, Connecticut to show us the sadness and the sorrow and the horror of what those people had experienced. And yet, if we've continued to follow the news, we see how those horrible events have effected so little change. We hate to pick on the United States because our country is not perfect and we have many of the same problems. We too have a gun problem in our country. But certainly in their country, they have a gun problem. And it's not just a legislative problem, as is often presented, it's also a moral and a spiritual one. But as I've followed the news over the last year, it seems to me that it is not even one bit less likely that something like that could happen again. And yet, even in the midst of our sorrow and our frustration, there is good news. God has come into the world as it actually is. It is not that we have to perfect the world in order to earn God's favor, but that in love and grace, God is at work in the world as it really is. And even more than that, God is at work to save and to transform our world. For in the good news of the story of Jesus, his birth in Bethlehem, his faithful life, and in his death and his resurrection, we have confident hope that God can and will, and in fact already has, overcome the worst that the world has to offer. Life, as we all know, can be the best of times, and it can be the worst of times. And the worst of times are really bad. They're really painful. And they can take away hope and confidence in the future. But the good news is this, that one day, the kingdom of God that was in its infancy in Jesus will be here on earth in its fullness by the grace of God. And one day, it will be the best of times for those baby boys of Bethlehem and their mothers, for the families of Newtown, for all who suffer, and for all of us